So I had a bit of a chance to discuss with some of you yesterday to get a bit of an idea of the kind of topics, and I hope I made a good selection of being broad, covering some of the basics and also going into some details. So the structure of my talk will be one big part, kind of 45 minutes, and please interrupt me if you have questions, and then we have time for a discussion. And if there's still time, then I have another part which is 12 minutes, which will go into the layer-specific fMRI, which might be interesting for some of you, and how that affects multimodal and multi-method and multi-scale neuroscience, because it highlights experiments that we do in collaboration with colleagues from rodent brains, compare that to fMRI brains, compare that to computational models. So that's an overview of what we do also in the Human Brain Project. But I want to start at a slower pace with the first part, and since it's cognitive systems for non-specialists, I thought it might be a good time, a good occasion to talk about the term cognition. I will talk about internal models and counterfactual cognition and prediction of our environment. But let's start to look at this term cognition. Cognition started as a movement against behaviorism. Behaviorism, so it's a bit of history. Behaviorism had been the dominant school of psychology and philosophy, well, psychology, but of how to study scientifically, objectively, the mind, the brain. And that came out of a movement. It was a counter movement of deep psychology, which was a field that wasn't able to compare between animals and humans, let's say, and was very difficult to make an objective science out of it. So by maturing and becoming, psychology wanted to become a proper objective science. Was important to move into a field in which you have some terms that you can talk about. So they treated the brain as a black box, and here to make it to highlight this like a vending machine. If you try to figure out how a vending machine works, and you say I'm just going to look into the input-output system. So and every terminology I use will be describing this kind of pattern. You know, you can find out quite a few things. It's all about food at vending machines. It's about rewards. You put money in, and so on. And that's kind of what behaviorism started. Lots of terminology, conditioning, behaviorism, classical conditioning, punishment, negative punishment, and so on. These kind of terminology were to do with animal experiments that you could do, condition animals, and see how they learn, and refer to how humans learn. And that was successful to some extent, but it was also greatly a failure in other respects. And in the 50s, a counter movement started, which was the cognitive turn, called, or cognitive revolution, taking the internal of the black box very serious. So whereas before, imagery, for example, had not been in the realm of science, because you cannot talk about something that the black box is doing, you could start to do this with using the term of cognition, right? So in cognition, mental processes were studies such as attention, imagery, mind wandering, the use of language, problem solving, creativity, thinking, and all of these kind of fields that were excluded in behaviorism to a larger extent. The revolution was kind of started. One famously was Noam Chomsky, who realized, you know, children that come to birth, they have an urge of learning language. They have in their machinery something that drives them to understand a certain grammar that is outside in the structure. So whereas behaviorism tried to explain everything with reinforcement and learning, you know, terms, for example, by being reinforced with food. You know, this is an apple. Okay, so now you know this. You know how it tastes and so on. So like reinforcement learning, that's patterns from behaviorism. Cognition now understood there's a structure within the brain that makes children understand language, it's very important to understand. Piaget was someone who never who was in parallel to behaviorism and various others. With cognition is now the kind of a dominant framework, but I would argue that it is now a time of yet another paradigm shift, which is the framework of predictive coding. Because what cognition created, which you see at these terms, is a lot of specialized terms for different things. You know, this bag of tools, if you like, attention, imagery, language, memory, as if it is in the brain. There are lots of toolboxes with totally unrelated mechanisms to one another. And sometimes if you go to different fields of psychology, neuroscience, you get this impression. You know, the one corner of the poster session can hardly speak to the other corner because they have used totally different kind of languages. But the brain actually looks absolutely similar in the different corners of the field they are talking about. So is there in any way a unifying theory of the brain and neuroscience? And yes, there is one on the block, one proposal. It is to do with predictive coding, and that's at the core of understanding the brain mechanisms, because you want to understand how did these different tools develop and what do they solve? What kind of problem do they solve? And predictive coding is at the heart of this. Carl Friston had proposed that this is a unifying theory of the brain and goes back to actually explain all organisms. As soon as they have a membrane, they start to have an internal model of some parameters, potentially, like food parameters or something. And if they can manipulate the movements, then the movements try to minimize a prediction error and to get fed, for example. So it's a very strong paradigm. Free energy principle, it's called, or predictive coding, predictive mechanisms, and so we will spend some time about this. It also clears up, in my view, some of the terminology, because to some extent we have created a divide between perception and action. Motor response and steps in between, like attention and so on. Predictive coding provides a kind of framework in which it makes not so much sense to have these divisions. Here, just one quick example why behaviorism is a failure, or where we have moved to. 2006 paper, Science, very important, of Owen, showing two brains, one of a patient totally healthy with the instruction to imagine playing tennis. This is on the left left lower, and you have some SMA activity, and then on the right you have instructed the subject to move around the house, and you get another pattern of activity. Now this is a patient that is not responsive. The patient is in the vegetative state, and you might have, Cyril might have mentioned something about this yesterday in his talk, but this patient was giving, so there's no response, no way of telling how much the patient is understanding. So he was instructed, the patient was instructed to play tennis or to navigate through their own house, and by the brain activity, you can tell that the patient has the same kind of pattern as a normal control. So you can infer, but just by this instruction of imagery and no response, which is outside of behaviorism, right? You can say, oh, there's a minimal cognitive state. This patient is able to respond to these instructions. And here I'm just going to highlight another example from Tim Mitchell. This is from YouTube. It's from a CBS TV series. It's a bit hype, but it gives you a good idea.
Almost real time.
So you've never done an instant analysis, as we might say on television?
Nobody's done this, ever.
That's actually her brain?
That's her brain.
Inside the scanner, Megan was shown a series of 10 items and asked to think for a few seconds about each one.
If it all comes out right, when she's thinking hammer, the computer will know she's thinking hammer.
Right. Okay, we're all done.
So Megan,
Yes.
How was it?
It wasn't bad.
Good.
Within minutes, the computer, unaware of what pictures Megan had been shown, and working only from her brain activity patterns as read out by the scanner, was ready to tell us, in its own voice, what it believed was the first object Megan had been thinking about.
I think the word is knife.
All right, one.
Right.
Bingo. All right.
Then the second.
I think the word is hammer.
All right.
I think the word is
It's only
window.
always a multiple choice. It's two decisions, right?
It's perfect, right?
So far.
And it continued to be, word after word.
Apartment.
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. Well done, well done.
Good thinking.
And of course, this is just the beginning.
Exactly.
Who knows what you're going to be able to read? It's a
That's
little
right.
scary, actually.
Well, that's our research program for the next 5 years.
What?
To see how, we're not satisfied with hammer.
Okay, and it continues with John Dillon's Haynes lab with brain reading of intentions and yeah, and so many labs, ours including, are involved in this kind of brain reading exercises. Now there, to this movie, a few caveats. You saw it was a multiple choice. There were two alternatives given, and so maybe that's a little bit easier. But there are other machineries that would take some brain reading attempts. For example, even dream reading is something that is done by waking up subjects that have just slept in the scanner, and the dream reading machinery is able to identify some of the items. So say, okay, it was a sailing boat and it was dark, or it was a sports car and a house. And the subjects, and that's then compared to the self-reports of the subject that just woke up and said, I remember two people and we were driving around, something. So this is possible. In this particular case, what was quite interesting is that Megan was not in the scanner before. So the multi-voxel pattern classifier algorithm, the brain reading algorithm, wasn't trained on this subject. So it extrapolates. And so that brings a very interesting question. We want to understand, how do these concepts of the external world, like the hammer, get represented in these brains, where we know that the structure is those of layered neuronal, neurons in the layered cortex. And we know that this structure has evolved over the evolution to be quite comparable between different animals. So there are quite a few questions that we would like to understand. And if we could find good computational models of describing this, for example, the IT cortex, the cortex to understand visual object recognition in deep encoding networks, deep convolutional networks, for example, which are a good candidate, then we get closer to understanding the essentials of the brain mechanisms that are taking place. And we'll, towards the end, also come back to explaining predictive coding and an extension of deep convolutional networks, because these are feed-forward networks, whereas predictive coding talks a lot about feedback. It's the most important conceptual pathway. Okay, so quite a lot to talk about. Let's look again into the visual hierarchy in the visual system. Before we get to IT cortex, we have a hierarchy of various visual areas which have an increasing complexity in their receptive fields. They combine contours to edges to forms and to complex objects like faces, houses, objects, scenes, and so on. So a lot is known about this feed-forward connectionist pathway, and we will need to focus and understand the conceptual contribution of the cortical feedback, which sometimes outnumbers the feed-forward. But in general, there's a rule: every area that is connected feed-forwardly is also connected reciprocally feedback. we know relatively little about these feedback connections. Also, another statistics, any area, the chance that any two areas are directly connected with monosynaptic connections is around 70% in the cortex. So any area is talking to any other area. So also very important. So conceptually, David Mumford proposed, that's him, winning a medal, proposed a kind of conceptual framework for the functions of cortical feedback. And he says, I put forward a hypothesis on the role of the reciprocal topographic pathways. The higher area attempts to fit its abstraction to the data that it receives from the lower areas, sending back to them its deep, well, that gets more specific in the neuroanatomy. It says it sends back to the deep layers, but also to the superficial layers, a kind of a template reconstruction, a best fitting, or if you like, a good guess of what it should look like at a lower level. The lower areas attempt to reconcile the reconstruction of its view that it receives from the higher areas. So given the context from higher areas and the evidence that comes feed forward, how well does this fit together? This is the kind of computational core unit, if you like. And one more conceptual framework is that of temporal integration receptive fields. So when I say receptive fields get bigger from V1 to higher areas in IT cortex, so do the temporal expansion of receptive fields. That's something not many talk about, but in the context of predictive coding, I think it's extremely important. And so I want to walk you through this one slide from a line of research from Uri Hassan, who's in Princeton now. And he presented movies to his subjects. And I think it started with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, a very engaging Hollywood movie. And people watching that movie have a large extent, actually everything that's colored in here are areas that are correlated from one brain to another. So if you take just the Talach coordinate from this area down here and you correlate that with 10 other brains, it will look pretty much the same. Very high correlation, 99% and so on. It only works with good, exciting movies. And the color codes shows something about the temporal integration. So what he did now is he chopped this movie into smaller parts. So into, let's say, 30 seconds component, and then into 12 and 4 seconds component, and jittered them, and showed this new movie, which now didn't tell a good story anymore, but still had the same kind of visual input. So the same visual input was presented to 10 different subjects, but now the story was kind of missing. So it's, it stopped, and so the correlation goes away in these higher areas, in those green and these red areas. And then if it's lower than 12 seconds in the green areas and down to 4 seconds in the blue areas. So even though the visual input is the same, everyone starts to have an idiosyncratic storyline and they don't fit well to another. Okay? So now some basics about the Bayesian framework. So for those of you who have heard this, and it's just a rerun for those that haven't, it might be a good time to start looking into this. I would advise you to this book, for example, from Jacopowi, a very nice way, and I go, so to say, through some of the introductory section, first chapters, which uses the Bayesian framework of explaining it. It's one of the potential frameworks. Bayesian is very powerful. It's not the only one, but so the brain is faced with this kind of problem. Let's say you wake up on a Sunday and you hear outside of your window this kind of sound. So your brain comes up with various hypotheses. And it now checks the likelihood of those hypotheses being true. So one would be, it could be a woodpecker right in front of your window. Another one, and you have your spectrogram, and the kind of question is that the typical sound that I would get from the woodpeckers on a Sunday morning? How good is the likelihood that your model, your hypothesis, is confirmed by the sound? So that's the actual sound, and this is your internal model, your memory, your knowledge, your world knowledge of a proper woodpecker. So then an alternative hypothesis could be, no, it's actually a hammer, or it could be a cow, right? Okay, the spectrogram of a cow looks quite different. So the likelihood that was a cow is very low. It could be piano. That's a hypothesis. Piano outside of your window, and so on. Formula 1, or it could be a Martian that is trying to trick you and pretending to be a woodpecker and making precisely that sound that you think is a woodpecker. And of course, the Martian does it knowing you very well. So that's also a very high likelihood that this sound then would sound as depicted here. And so you can put numbers to that. So the likelihood of a woodpecker is 0.8, but actually you can't determine it from a hammer. It's pretty much the same thing, 0.8. Cow, very unlikely. Piano, not at all. Formula 1 car, not at all. And yeah, here we go. The Martian, very good. It's precisely tricks you, very, very good. So now let's look into a second parameter, and that's your world knowledge that you have acquired over your lifetime and your background knowledge. And it's Sunday, particular time of the day, and so the woodpecker. That's when you usually hear the woodpecker. It's absolutely that gives some chance, and your neighbor not working on Sunday morning, so it's not so probable. So we're checking the probability now. It's not so probable that it is actually a hammer. Cow is not around your house, so that would be very unlikely, and so on. And very importantly, the Martian, from all what you know, is a very unlikely, no, I used the wrong terminology, a very improbable explanation, because that doesn't fit to your world knowledge. And now you can depict this by a combination of these likelihood and priors, and that gives you the posterior, and so therefore you have a good winner. And even though there's a good likelihood of the sound being created by a Martian, the posterior is 0, and all alternatives are also clearly disregarded. So perceptually, you have the concept of the winner of this woodpecker. And with this, you can explain a lot of mechanisms. You can play around with this. Let's say in bistable situations, it's a powerful method. It has also some criticism because it goes on and on, this hypothesis testing. But you can construct for yourself, to play around. What is an example in which you have a high likelihood but a low prior? My example was that with a Martian, or where you have a low likelihood and a high prior. Let's say you're expecting, someone enters the room, you know exactly their voice, and they speak in a very high voice. The likelihood is, it doesn't really fit. But your prior is you should hear something else. It gives you lots of surprise. Then you realize they tricked. They swallowed some helium or so. Changed their voice. You need to update your internal model. You need a new prediction to explain that away. So now you have this in a hierarchy in which you're passing up and down. Downwards, you're passing predictions. Upwards, you're passing, given those predictions, kind of a combination. You subtract the evidence with your priors and see what remains. So the prediction can explain something away, and here are examples. Let's say you see a cat going behind a fence. Now, if you're just a single neuron, having a very low, small receptive field, trying to explain what this kind of visual pattern, then it's difficult to explain that it's a continuous cat, because it was on off the shape of the cat sphere. But with some higher up receptive fields, you get a bigger story, you get the concept, and in this context, you can explain the evidence that comes in, the likelihood, because given the bigger explanation, the bigger picture, it now makes sense and can be predicted. So this is used for binocular rivalry or for other situations in which you can now explain which hypothesis dominates. Let's say you have a face presented to the one side of your one eye and housed to the other eye. At some point, the evidence is perceived, your internal model is that of a face, and that explains downwards away all these items that fit to the face, but doesn't totally get rid of the input signal. And so then you try to explain, your forward projection is the prediction error, so something is unexplained, and your internal model switches at some point to explain the house. So now you're thinking, okay, there's a house, and that explains well this unexplained evidence, but doesn't explain the face, and so it switches back and forth. And that's another example. He goes into very much details. So I'm going to use this kind of framework now to explain some of our experiments and findings. I'm going to start with something that was a nice follow-up of a series of experiments that we have done. So here you have this apparent motion illusion with a complex pattern, because it has an item, it has a grating to it. So when seeing these two dots, you create internal model of a smooth perception of a smooth movement, and not one of totally two independent blinking dots, even though you know that there's space in between. You think it's an item that is moving. Maybe it can't be seen or jumps back and forth. Now, they tested this, the group of Mok Shim in Princeton, actually, and using a brain reading technology, a decoder, to ask the question, is in the middle space, is there a representation in area V1, first cortical area, of a grating, of a new feature, of a new grating that hasn't been presented before, of this vertical grating that makes sense because it's in between the other two. And you could see when they found that these kind of predictions, the internal model of the smooth movement, made this new prediction of a new feature in its downward presentation. We used a simplified version. So our work was the early one. It goes back to 2005, and the most important paper is 2010. But here I'm using one from 2012, which is a nice extension using this apparent motion paradigm in comparison to a schizophrenic population. So here we have a very simple paradigm of apparent motion in which this up and down movement is tested, the internal model, by a test stimulus that is either in time or out of time with this illusion. Let me show this again. Here's an out of time, so it moves up and down, and sometimes there's a test stimulus shown here. This is in a space-time plot, so you have this two blinking dots, and in between these are blinks that are consistent with the hypothesis, and these are blinks that are inconsistent. And so the question is, which ones can be recognized better? And what we find, these dark ones that are consistent with the internal model can be recognized better in patients as well as in controls. And this is specific to the apparent motion. If you have blinking conditions, you won't see them. So this is fMRI activity along the apparent motion trace at this blinking point. The dark one is shown in green, and the gray one in blue. So even though the difference between this one and this one are 30 milliseconds, so you have this full paradigm, but once you have the blink here and once you have the blink there, it's only 30 milliseconds difference. And fMRI is sensitive enough to see the difference, because in the one case you perceive the blinking more often than in the other one. And when you see it more, you have a lower fMRI bold activity. Now that's a bit surprising. You know, you usually would think the more activity, the better to perceive. But in the predictive coding framework, it makes sense, because if you have an expectation, if you have a top-down prediction that then gets confirmed, no news, you know, not much activity. But if you have a prediction and you have something that is a violation of that, it's an error signal. An error signal needs to first be resolved before it can be consciously perceived and updates your internal model. So the error signal is actually the one, this one, higher bold signal, but the one that is detected less often. And so that's one confirmation. Predictive coding has been proposed more on theoretical lines of research, and goes back to Helmholtz, for example. He made the observation that if you look around, the world is stable, but if you move your eye, so if you move your eye internally, you know, the world stays stable. But if you take you try it. You have all tried that? Use your finger and move your eyeball. The whole world moves a little bit. So why is that? Because you don't generate internally a prediction of how the world will move with your eye movements. He called it reference principle. So you do plan an eye movement, and then you know how everything is retinally changed. So we looked into this as well. This is going to be the next example. So what it shows, this is the kind of conceptual framework model from Rao and Ballard. It's very simplified, just to drive home this principle. If you have a hierarchy of visual areas, for example, these areas are actually, the main purpose is to predict and to send down their predictions. And at a lower level, the predictions are compared to the input. And if the top-down prediction explains everything, then job done. If something isn't explained, then it creates a prediction error, and the prediction error is sent forward. So the feed-forward stream is just a passing of messages that didn't quite fit. It's an extreme view. The more generalized model nowadays has also a pathway in which you have message passing that confirms the internal model, and it's a combination of both. But it's important that these feedback stream is the one of sending predictions, and the feed forward is, oh no, something isn't quite fitting. So it is essential for understanding brain processes. Is arguably cortical feedback is the most important mode of brain processing, because you get the kind of top-down perception, what's currently understood. And it's the brain process of which we have relatively little knowledge. I mean, if you walk over neuroscience, you know, posters and models and so on, they describe the receptive fields. They don't use terminology of like a predictive field, for example. But it's central to the unifying theories of the brain of Carl Friston, Jeff Hawkins, Roe Ballard, David Mumford, Helmholtz, and others, many others. Cyril mentioned it yesterday quite a few times. But for this theory to really have teeth, it needs to be, it needs to work. It needs to work fast. It needs to work be validated in more complex environments. So I used a very simplified version of this. We have tested here whether it's actually true that you have an internal model that is sent downward. And to do this, to do a causal test of that, we used the same paradigm with this in-time, out-of-time difference, but we used the TMS pulse in the area V5, which we think is underlying the motion percept. And if you do that, prior to the actual test stimulus, which is shown here, if you have TMS prior to the onset of the stimulus, then this difference becomes non-significant. is greatly reduced. Whereas in the other conditions, that's the replication of the effect I showed you before. So in time, out of time being processed differently. So by this evidence, we show that it is an internal model that area V5 is creating and is interfering with an area lower in the hierarchy, V1. Now we combine this with eye movement, like Helmholtz did in a way. Is it such that a prediction can move over a saccade? And the experiment now becomes a little bit more complicated. So here the task is to look at the green spot. Okay, so you watch here, and then you do a saccade. And while you do the saccade, after you have done the saccade, there will be a test stimulus. And the test stimulus, again, can be in time or out of time. Now this is for the brain quite complicated, because when you do a saccade, first this illusion is processed in the right visual field, so that's in the left cortex, left hemisphere. Now you do the saccade, and everything will be processed in the right hemisphere. So now you will be here. It's a left visual field, and the right primary visual cortex is processing the stimulus. So in this area, does V1 have any knowledge about the difference between in time and out of time? So does the prediction, your world knowledge, your prior experience, does that make any difference? And yes, as we found, you have a difference. So that's the new hemisphere, which is just seeing this target point. It's at this target location, retinotopically mapped out. At this blue location for this target spot, this is the activity. And there are three kind of lines. One is to do with the enhancement related to your prediction, to the apparent motion. It goes back to a 2005 paper we had in PLOS Biology showing that when you have a hypothesis there should be some movement, you have some higher activity. Then there's a test stimulus on top of that, which is the little dot. And this enhances the activity, but it enhances in two different ways. If it's in time with your prediction, it's the smaller one, and if it's out of time, it's the higher one. It's again an arrow signal. So this is the prediction effect, if you like. And so in this one example, it summarizes two important features. One is higher areas present a prediction down, and they update them fastly to saccading positions. And that's this higher activity. So it's active. It's driven from inside out, if you like. And it's testing something. It's testing, oh, I would predict now and now and now something to come in. And if it is confirmed, then it's processed differently than if it is violated. So that's our latest from the series of experiments. That's from December last year. So let's wrap up so far a bit of what we have talked about. So this is a single cell. As soon as it has a membrane, you can start talking about prediction mechanism, because there's an internal world, and if it is meaningfully representing something in the outside world, it might have a higher chance to survive. So there's an evolutionary principle that might underlie predictive coding. This is a picture that depicts the interconnectedness of cortex, in which we don't know the message passing that is going back and forth, and the meaning and the content of this passing. But one hypothesis is it is concerned about making internal models about the outside world. So this is called the predictive processing framework, if you like. And it has triggered a conceptual revolution. There are several books that came out. One of Jeff Hawkins, for example, which everyone in my lab has to read. I quite like that. Jeff Hawkins will come to Maastricht next year to the HBP summit. Moshe Bar, he has been looking into predictive coding for the longest time, maybe. Jacob Hovey, I mentioned. Andy Clark, a brilliant book, Surfing Uncertainty, from philosophers coming into the field. For example, Andy Clark kind of talks about this taking away of the deviation of perception and action, because to reduce. So let's just make a more general example. Let's say if you're thirsty, that's a prediction error. You want to. Now there are two ways to reduce that. One is, I mean, there's a glass of water and your hand is here, and it should be there. You should be drinking it. So it's a prediction error. Why is it not there? So two ways of resolving this. One is you update your internal model and you're not thirsty. You say, so that's one way. Another one is to reduce the prediction error, and that is the movement to the glass and starting to drink this. And so in this example, you see that the perception action combine into one framework, and that's a kind of an important way. Now there are many components to this. It's very important in the artificial intelligence community. Predictive coding has been used in various robots. This one example, Jeff Hawkins' algorithm, he created a hierarchical temporal modeling, HTM, in this company in Numenta in California. And these robots, for example, are used by Dishik Kim in Korea to implement Jeff Hawkins' architecture and then train these robots with these HTM models to learn environment and so on. And there are many others. Those are just examples. There are some theoretical motivation and discussions, of course, about the underlying cortical architecture. So we look a lot into these layers of cortex. Are they confirmed like Mumford proposed, and or are there differences? Then there are different models. The HTM Hawkins model is one. HBP, we developed several different versions. I talked about deep encoding networks that get now a feedback stream of predictions and how they involve. And Nico Kriegeskorte, for example, develops one which he calls BLT, and bottom-up, lateral, and top-down. And we can find improvements of this architecture. This is summarizing. This one picture summarizes 30 years of Grossberg's architectures of resonance ART networks, adaptive resonance theory, and he uses in 50% of his papers this image actually. So it's not so. But here the idea is you have an internal model, a hypothesis that resonates with the input, makes it quite a different prediction than predictive coding, where it says it subtracts, it reduces this. It still is a implementation, as I would say, of predictive processing. And so the kind of discussions can be about how is this hypothesis testing implemented? Does this resonate with the evidence, or does it subtract? This is Rao and Ballard's model. It's a subtraction model. And I think Grossberg says the evidence that's out there is 9-1 or 8-2 in his favor. So there are more models that are kind of resonating with the evidence than the subtraction. However, there are many fields in between. I think the important conceptual framework is still one of testing hypothesis and negotiating the input. And there's an evolutionary perspective to it, I highlighted. And there's also a clinical aspect to this. So predictive coding frameworks are now used to understand the symptoms in schizophrenia and autism and aging and anxiety. Some might have the internal model that something just doesn't look right. This person is maybe an imposter. It doesn't feel right, and or an airplane that's flying by is a surprise for, let's say, a schizophrenic subject who would then start update an internal model that says, oh, it's a spy following me, just me. It's all about this airplane and me. And this internal model in this pathology does not get updated on error signals. Usually we would receive in our environment prediction errors, that there's no additional evidence, that other people don't agree with his explanations, and these prediction errors would then correct our internal belief. And in schizophrenia, for example, that seems not to be happening, so there's the negotiations of updating internal models is insufficient. So here are examples. This connectivity and this message passing might have to do with prediction. One very immediate is how vision and action are related. So you can play tennis if you're not compensating for the neuronal delays up to the point that you're planning your movement to be a second ahead of time, and you're estimating the ball and so on. It's self-evident. And we have these predictions all the time. So while we're walking about, our internal model, our brain is actually predicting what's happening, what the kind of environment, the sound. We don't notice that. I'm going to mention two examples. One is an escalator. You notice it when the escalator stops and you're walking up. You can walk up a normal stair and it doesn't feel so strange, but the stopping escalator is weird, right? It feels, because it should be moving. So there was another experiment where they had kind of a office space at NASA where they had a room that could be rotated 60 degrees or so. And they've used that as office space regularly every day. And one day they changed the orientation, so you could come into the same room, but now the room is like 60-degree rotated. And the report is that the subjects get sick during the day. They work on I mean, how often have you entered an office where you have never been? You know, it could have rotated or not, you don't know. And you sit down and work. There's nothing strange about it, you know. But if you're used to the room being 60 degrees rotated to your internal model of the outside world, it's a problem. So even though you're doing something totally different, you know, suddenly they all reported they were very much irritated. So you have these internal models and predictions that you're running around with. They seem very important. Communication is very important, especially for stand-up comedians. If you're not thinking and predicting and guided down the garden path and have a twist at the end, you wouldn't find it funny. And so everything that matters is, so to say, in these kind of predictions. We used a very simple example of creating a movie, making a small break and then a test stimulus to see whether the movie in your mind continues. And so you have this little jump, and here's an example where the jump is too big. And do you notice the jump? So we make some control in which we jittered all the images, and then it wouldn't make a difference because you don't have a proper prediction. And what we find, surprisingly, already in early visual cortex, primal visual cortex V1, you have this specific distinction. If something fits to your internal world, after this gap, you have a small attenuation of the activity. Something is explained away, it fits. So we looked into the areas that create this, and it's this medial temporal lobe, medial parietal cortex region that Moshe Bar calls the scene association area. And so the idea here is that from hippocampus, and maybe including also cerebellum, you have a signal that goes into here and kind of predicts how the scene will continue, how things change in the next seconds or so. And this is part of the default mode network, these regions, and they have been stimulated in a great deal of different experiments. Here's a beautiful review article from Buckner in 2007. And they use this image of mind pictures. So you have this one picture, but then you can ask different questions about the scene of the, you can ask, what is he thinking, or what is she thinking, or what has happened before, or what will happen. And so you enter into the situation in different ways. And those are ideas in which you can test theory of mind. What is the other one thinking? Remembering, kind of constructing the previous scene, or predicting what happens next. And all of this is kind of negotiated in the same default mode network that is overlapping with these findings that we had before. And now we're moving more towards the kind of from a prediction in milliseconds to prediction of longer time frames, seconds and storytelling. And now we're moving into something which I call counterfactual states. And that is, if you like, mental imagery, mental comparison, mental task are some examples that I've used, but I will move now even further. To do an example is mind wandering. So while you're driving, you can rehearse your talk, let's say. You can still drive very well. Or I tell you a story about a giraffe that I've seen in a zoo. And you can follow my description, and you have some kind of a mental representation of that, if you like. But everything, it doesn't become more likely that there will be a giraffe. It doesn't interfere with the current story. So somehow, before I talked about predictive coding and how much our brain is in the here and now, making judges and inferences, but there's something which is very important, and that is how we're using this to make a counterfactual situation, how we're doing mind wandering. 48% of you are mind wandering just now, or the other way over. Everyone is usually 48% of the time of the day thinking about something else. Who's mind wandering? So no one has just been mind wandering. The reason no one, because many people wouldn't notice, because the 48% of you listening, of course, didn't understand the question. So how does that work? And I think so here's it's a hype, right? Predictive coding. This is the papers coming out. I started with this with my ERC grant in 2007, focused on predictive coding, and but build up to that. But now it's really and we proposed at that time. I mean, this was written and before we said this will be a huge change, and it was a huge change. Now it's in the textbooks and everyone is talking about it. So what's the next cool thing? I think the next important thing is to explain this kind of mind wandering in predictive coding terminology, because evolutionary, that must be a very successful way. You creating, we have higher chances to survive because we can make a plan to walk over that hill to the next valley, to the promised land, because that is the better area. We can use our communication to agree that that's a good idea, so we can simulate that. We can do joint mind wandering. Everyone is saying, yeah, that's a good idea. Then we take the hardship of climbing over the mountain to reach this area. Now, you're predicting something over weeks and months and years, and keep up this kind of internal model that is, if you come to the promised land and it's actually dry and isn't good, that would be a surprise that you will try to minimize. Prediction error minimization is what it's all about. And that tribe wouldn't survive, but the ones that are really, really good at making this hypothesis, then they are the winners evolutionary. And of course, that's what our brains have become to be very good at. How do we do this? So we started some experiments looking into this. So Angus Pater in my lab did this wonderful movie. Let's summarize a little bit what we have done. Yeah, okay. So here you have the hierarchy of the visual areas. So it starts with V1, V2, V3, and others. And it shows the kind of interconnectedness, of course, of the whole brain. And the question is, what's the message passing here? So here you have visual stimulation coming in a typical fMRI experiment. And in the warm colors, you see the message passing feed-forwardly. And in blue, you have the kind of predictions going back and the negotiations between these two pathways. And so that's what's happening, and that's what's training the internal models to fit to the outside world. They are good models because they explain well this context. Our subjects have seen the stimulus again and again. For retinotopic mapping, they know exactly what's happening. So this top-down is explaining very well what's happening. But also, while we do that, subjects thinking of something totally different, right? It's extremely boring experiment. So even the visual cortex will be involved in doing something else. So what is this something else, and can we find evidence for that? So rats do it. They think about the maze and where to find food while they are asleep and while they are doing something other very boring task. We have shown an experiment in which we blindfolded subjects, so no visual input, and presented them rich auditory sounds. We can see that visual cortex is involved making predictions, like the woodpecker, let's say. You find activity in visual cortex related to these stimuli. We think of doing experiments in which you put building blocks on top of each other. That's something that Jeff Tenenbaum has created and compares. Children are very good in estimating how a tower falls down. And how do we do this? Because, we generate models of how a tower should fall apart and compare them to the reality. So we have these kind of feed-forward modeling for generations. So we want to understand how these things work and how they're interacting with knowledge, for example, of stability and weight. So for example, knowing that the purple ones are really heavy makes this a stable figure. Knowing that the green ones are heavy, more heavy than the purple one, makes that a very fragile constellation, and so on. But he did something different, and that's our first experiment, pilot experiments there, but it's 15 subjects. So here it's about moving in a maze, and the maze has 4 rooms, and in the fMRI experiment, we're moving from one room to another, so it's just 2 rooms. But before we're doing this, subjects get training to emerge into this with virtual reality. You have these different rooms, and you can interact with them, play ball, play football, destroy things, after this training, they get very familiar, the subjects, knowing what happens in the different rooms, where they are relatively to one another, and then they go into the scanner. And okay, you get the idea. I move forward. And we have now two situations. One is when they are moving out of one room, and one when they are moving into another room. And let's say there are 2 scenarios. You can move out of this room and move to the right, or move to the left. You get the signal whether you go left or right will be given to you prior to each trial. So while you're here, you know, oh, it will be a left trial. So you go out here and move into this room. And you can be here, and let's say the prior trigger was it's a right movement trial, so you move out of here and into this room. So in those 2 scenarios, you will move into the same room while you're still moving out of the first room. So the first 6 seconds, you're moving out of this room or of this room. So the visual input is totally different. But your target will be moving into this room in this scene. So we can ask the questions what your internal models are thinking of the situation right now, whether they are processing the room you're in, or whether they're processing the room that you're moving to. If we find a code that is relative to the room we are moving to, it's quite surprising because the visual input is totally different. It's 2 different rooms. And vice versa, we have another scenario in which you start from the other room and do this comparison. And in the second phase, we move into a room, let's say this one or this one, and we can use brain reading to see how much information you have of this room and whether you have information traces of the previous room that you came from. And the subjects really love this experiment. So you're in the scanner, you move out of the room, and they're all saying, you know, you have heard you will move left, you can't stop thinking of the room you will move into. So what we find is first the room that we move into, the second room, is shown here. And now we have two ways. Usually when I give a talk, I talk about this paradigm, usually 50 minutes, which is our occlusion paradigm. So we have this big occlusion, this white spot. There's no feed-forward input. And we do all our brain reading in this area of cortex. We have no feed-forward input. That's good, because then you have no receptive fields, and that's the loud activity that's happening there is overlaid with the predictive code. So how do you separate these two things? Well, if we listen into this area where it's just noisy pattern, we can see that there's feedback. So we hear the kind of predictive codes, whereas if we look into here, we just see the feed-forward signal. So we have these two different pathways. Here they are shown in blue, the feedback, the whispering, if you like, and in red, the feed-forward. In this area, we can decode the room that we are currently in from the feed-forward signal, shown in red, and from the feedback signal. So that's the second room where we have moved into. This is just significant. It's relatively low, but it's kind of, it's good enough. So you have some information in here about the room, even though it's not feed-forward stimulated, coming from all kinds of areas in the brain, feeding back to, in this case, V3. Decoding the past isn't possible, so the room we came from isn't possible here. But now the exciting thing is the room that the first episode, the room that we came from, in this room, you can decode, again, the room that is in with feed-forward information, but it's a lot less. So it's as if there are already less good signal, and the feedback signal doesn't work at all. And if you look into the decoding of the future room, you see that the feedback signal is actually thinking about the next room rather than the current room. So there are two main effects here. One is the very simple feed-forward prediction is reduced. So, saying how good is the signal of this room, you can classify very highly, but you can classify that as good in the first room. And the second effect is that your classification of the future room is possible in the first room, but not the one of the past in the second room. So to summarize, what the brain reading tells us here is, while in the room, the brain anticipates already the next place you're going to, and once reached that goal, you're not looking back. So that's how far we are right now. We haven't changed the instructions, so maybe we get this code where you came from if we make it really relevant. So if you're in the second room and you have to remember an item from the room you came from or something like this. We haven't done this so far. But why this is important is there seem to be two messages. While you're moving from room to room, you're thinking about where you're going to. Now this is maybe, this is how we expect things to be, maybe, but this is early visual cortex in this area, V3. And we want to understand these different codes and how can you have two codes simultaneously? And so this is a wild hypothesis for which I don't have much evidence, but I think what we will try is to use layer-specific fMRI. This is now looking into cortex at different layers to see whether we have maybe two separate codes, that one for where we're going to and the one for where we are currently. And I think with this I want to stop the kind of overview of what we're doing, and we can discuss that and I take some questions. So what I wanted to show here so far is that some proof of principles that are internal, that we have internal models, that the internal models are negotiating the kind of information that is coming in, and I used apparent motion as an example. There are other examples with auditory scenes and other complex situations that I didn't go into. We can tell something about mechanisms, that it's causal related by using TMS, for example, in V5, we can interfere with these internal models. They are fast enough to sustain eye movements. So even while we're doing eye movements, our predictions are jumping about. We can say something about the precision and the areas. So it happens in V1 and it happens in the superficial layer of V1. I didn't show you the evidence. That's something I could add. And we have looked into the counterfactual simulation, most prominently maybe in my last example, in which we show a double code that if you're in a room and you're planning to go to the next room, you have already some internal models of the next room. And this is interesting for computational modeling, but it's also interesting for patients of various kinds. And yeah, those are some of my team members. Angus talked about, showed the last example with the moving in the maze. The Gracie Edwards did the eye movement combination, and yeah, I leave it here. Okay, so thanks for your attention, and I'll take some questions now.